In this review video, we're going to talk about ObservableObject, StateObject, ObservedObject, and EnvironmentObject. Sounds like a lot, but they're all kind of closely related, so we'll get through it pretty quick. So let's start with ObservableObject, and we're going to start with the example that you see here on the screen as our typical view models that we've been using, right? By the way, we're in the Appetizers app. So as we've done before, right, we create a class, we have it conform to an observable object. And let's go into the documentation to see what Apple has to say about an observable object. Okay, so as you see in here, right, is a type of object with a publisher that emits before the object has changed. Kind of like how I described it, right, with how I say it broadcasts its changes, but let's go a little bit further. By default, an observable object synthesizes an object will change publisher that emits the changed value before any of its @published properties changed, right? So again, like I described, if you mark it @published, like this name variable here, whenever that variable changes or property changes, it's going to broadcast its change, right? I think I've said that a bunch throughout the course, but again, repetition is the key here. I'm repeating myself a lot on purpose, especially in this review section. Again, really want to drive the point home. But anyway, when this property changes, it broadcasts its change. So that's observable object in a nutshell, right? It's only one half of the equation because we got to set up somebody like listening to that change. But as far as just the observable object, it broadcasts the change, but you have to mark it @published. If you're running into a bug and you're like, my UI is not updating, what's going on? Double check to make sure you marked it @published, because if you don't mark it published, it's not going to broadcast it. Okay, back to Xcode to dig into this further. So let's walk through the example, right? We marked all of this stuff @published. Let's go through our array of appetizers just to walk through what's actually happening, right? So our array of appetizers we get from the network, right? This is our network call that we created. Well, in the success case, we get back an array of appetizers from the network, right? We decode the JSON into our object. So we set the appetizers we get back from the network equal to this array of appetizers up here. So now what just happened, we went from an empty array to a full array. And because we mark it published and it's an observable object, that change is going to trigger a broadcast. We're going to say, hey, whoever's listening, I got appetizers now. We updated. Update your UI, and who's listening, right? Our appetizer list view is who's listening, right? And this is how we set it up, right? Our state object view model. More on state object in a second, but now we have a property view model that is listening for those changes, right? So now when I do view model.appetizers, right, this view will trigger because that changed, it'll redraw, and now it's going to pull from my list of appetizers to create our list. So that's kind of the flow on how observable objects works and communicates. So now let's talk about this state object up here. And if you remember, the key difference, I've said it a bunch, between @StateObject and @ObservedObject and when you should use what is when you're creating an appetizer list view model, or you're creating an observable object, which our view model is, that's when you want to use StateObject, right? And by creating, we're setting it equal to in these parentheses, right? That's the initialization. You may hear it called instantiating, initializing, creating, all saying the same thing. But the reason we want to do that is because when we create it on this view, it acts just like a normal state. Like that's why it's called StateObject. Because now our appetizer list view owns this view model. And just like the state variable I described on our weather app, no matter how many times our appetizer list view gets created and destroyed, which is what happens when it gets redrawn, we're not going to instantiate a new view model, right? We're only going to create it once, and then SwiftUI is going to manage that, elsewhere. That way we can always reference this same view model no matter how many times our appetizer list view gets created and destroyed. Let's go to the documentation to basically reiterate what I just said. So here in StateObject, right, it's a property wrapper type that instantiates an observable object, right? Talked about creating one. If I scroll down a bit, here's the key, right? SwiftUI creates a new instance of the object only once for each instance of the structure that declares the object. So that's basically what I just said, back to Xcode. Whereas no matter how many times appetizer list view gets created and destroyed, we only have one view model. That way it can persist its state. Now let's shift to ObservedObject, which is what happens when you're not creating it here, you're passing it in from a parent view, right? The appetizer list view in this scenario, we're actually going to use the frameworks app, right? Wouldn't own the view model. It's going to be relied on it being passed in. Let's actually switch to the frameworks app to show it in real life. So here I am in the frameworks app, and this is what we just did in the optimization videos. So hopefully this is fresh review for you, but we also didn't deal with this as much as we did StateObject. So if you're still not quite sure, definitely hit me up in the comments, hit me up in Slack. I want you to really understand this stuff. It's important. So again, we use ObservedObject because, look, we're not initializing it. We're just declaring, hey, we have a view model that is of type, framework detail view model. We don't give it a value because we're expecting the value to be passed in when we create a framework detail view, right? It's relying on the data from the parent view. For this reason, and this is the difference between StateObject and ObservedObject, right? StateObject, like I said, that view will own that view model. Here, the ObservedObject, this framework detail doesn't own this. It will destroy this ObservedObject every time this gets created and destroyed. It doesn't care about it. The reason it can destroy it all the time is because every time a new framework detail view gets created, it's getting passed in a brand new view model, right? Let's go to our framework grid view, which is the parent view here, right? Whenever we tap on a framework, we show the sheet, we create a new framework detail view, which requires a view model, a framework detail view model. Again, we just implemented this a couple videos ago. But what's going on here is I have to pass in a view model. And again, we're initializing the view model. The view model takes a framework and a binding to showing detail view. But again, the reason why our actual framework detail view can just destroy this at will is because every time it gets recreated, it's getting injected like with a new view model that is created on the previous screen or previous view or parent view called the framework grid view. And the reason it gets created up here is because we're relying on data, right? We need to know what framework to show when we're presenting our framework detail view, right? That's why we pass in the selected framework. So that is ObservedObject. Again, back to it. I think the key thing to know, like you'll be pretty much safe if you just understand that, hey, if I'm passing in a view model, I need ObservedObject. If I'm creating a brand new view model, like in our framework grid view here, I need StateObject. If you just remember that rule of thumb, you'll be pretty good. Okay, now let's talk about EnvironmentObject, but for that, we got to go back to our appetizer app because that's where we used it, right? And the EnvironmentObject we created was the order, right? It's an observable object. This is what I meant by they're all kind of similar. So our order is just an observable object. So that's another key thing to remember, right? It doesn't have to be a view model, right? Remember, an observable object, the only thing you need to know about that is that it will broadcast its changes, right? If you mark it published. So in this case, right, we need our observable object to be accessed from multiple screens, right? We can add an appetizer from our appetizer list view, and then on our order view, we need to display, what's in our order, and we can swipe to delete, right? So multiple views, multiple screens need access to this observable object. This is different from a view model because our view model is very tightly coupled with a specific view, right? We don't want everything to have access to it, just that view. So that's the difference, right? EnvironmentObject, we want a lot of things to have access to it. That's the whole point. So where do we put it into the environment? Well, let's go to our app, right? The appetizer, app structure. And in our case, where we want our entire app to have access to it, we inject it into the environment at like the highest root view. And again, pulling up this visual, right, that we used before, that is our appetizer tab view, right? All the other views end up being children or their downstream views, however you want to look at it, from the appetizer tab view. So by injecting it into the environment here, everything's going to have access to it, which in our case, that's what we want. But remember, there are cases where you may not want everything to have access to it. Again, the example I used was the Apple settings app where I have to go 4 screens deep. Well, maybe I want to inject something into the environment like right at the settings root view, right? Not the entire app's root view, just the settings root view. That way everything downstream or all the children of the settings root view will have access to some sort of settings observable object that they can all access that. So coming back to our app object here, a key takeaway with EnvironmentObject is wherever you inject it matters greatly. Because if a view that's not part of the view hierarchy where you injected it, right, it's not one of the children, tries to access it, your app's going to crash. Let's review how you access this real quick, right? Okay, so back to our order example where we injected it at the root view, at our tab view, so everything has access to it. So in our appetizer detail view, right, the view that pops up, this is where we need access because this is where we're adding the appetizer. So if I scroll up, right, you do add environment object var order. Now, this just means, hey, I'm going to reach up into the environment and I'm going to get access to this single source of truth, right? So this environment object is a single source of truth for all the child views for it. So that's how the appetizer detail view has access to it, as well as our order view has access to it, because we're writing this add environment object property wrapper. And like I said, it has access to the same object. It's the single source of truth, just multiple views can adjust it. Now that's one scenario where you use EnvironmentObject. Another one is if you find yourself passing a binding down multiple views. Now I think all the examples we use, we're just passing a binding down like one view, which is fine. That's what it's meant for, that like one-to-one communication. But sometimes, you'll find yourself like having more child views. And if you find yourself passing a binding down like 5 views, that's a good time to use EnvironmentObject, where at that root view, you create an EnvironmentObject. That way you don't have to pass the binding from view A to view B to view C to view D. You just inject it at view A, and then view D, can automatically access it, right? You don't got to pass it all the way down the hierarchy. So that is another way to use EnvironmentObject. So that wraps it up for the quick review on passing data. Again, I want to stress quick because we've been over all this before, but I did just want to go over it one more time to hammer it home. But again, I know I've said this before, please, this is the most important part of the course. If you don't quite understand this, hit me up in Slack, leave a comment, call me. Like, I want you to understand this. I don't want you to leave this course having this be fuzzy at all. This is where all the value is. Okay, with my plea done, let's move on to the conclusion videos of the course.